My name's Susan Orgill and I'm a soil researcher with New South Wales DPI, and today we're going to be talking about some of our learnings from our work in the rangelands of New South Wales. The three of us are collaborating on a couple of projects together at the moment, and we hope you find this interesting.
Hi, I'm Craig Strong. I work for the Australian National Uni. I look at ground cover, wind erosion and biological soil crusts, one of the smallest fine-scale protectors of the soil.
And I'm Kirsty Yeates. I also work at Australian National University. My space is working in carbon drawdown through landscape regeneration, but also thinking about whole farm property planning, integration of biodiversity and maintaining those productive systems. I also work at Soils for Life, and we're really keen to support producers to share the incredible innovative work that they're doing and to encourage and support other producers to look after their landscapes.
Great. So the purpose of today is to start at the biggest scale and think about the big landscape processes which are driving carbon cycles, and then zoom down to think about what we can and cannot easily influence if we want to increase soil organic carbon in the rangelands. So our work has been, as I said, in the Western Division of New South Wales, and we've got ongoing trials which we're putting in place soon. The project is really looking at strategies and interventions to increase soil carbon sequestration. And a really important part of that is identifying responsive zones within the landscape.
Okay, so Suze, we're looking at New South Wales here at the moment. I can see a lot of different colours. Are those colours, can they tell us anything about the capacity of the soils to absorb carbon?
Most certainly. So when we're thinking about carbon, we need to think about the main drivers of getting carbon into the soil. So that's through organic matter supply, so growing more bigger, healthier plants, the diversity of plants, and providing ground cover. And then it's thinking about that rate of loss. So in the rangelands, a really important thing that we'll be touching on today is the importance of ground cover in protecting the soil surface and keeping carbon in the soil. And then we've also got decomposition, so that natural process of organic matter cycling. And that's really important for nutrient provision and for those functions which provide soil health and soil condition. So within the rangelands, what we know to date and where our work has been focused on is those bigger, broad-scale differences between our clay-rich soils and our sandier soils. So contrary to the eastern part of New South Wales, usually we associate higher carbon stocks with higher clay content and clay mineralogy. In the Western Division, it's a little bit different because of the main drivers being rainfall as well as management on organic matter supply. Our clay soils require more rainfall to actually wet up and saturate the profile so that those plants and those processes can start. Whereas on the lighter country, so the redder country that we can see in this map here, through here, those soils are generally more responsive to the smaller amounts or the less frequent rainfall events as well. So you get those fluctuations in pasture growth.
That's really interesting. Picking up on a comment you made before about the loss of carbon. So if I think about sandier soils or lighter soils, that's where we're most vulnerable from a wind erosion context. You get that sand, the sand gets moved, it bounces, it bombards, it starts to eject the really fine particles. So what you're suggesting and what your work is finding is that these red zones or these red soils have the greatest capacity to input carbon through plant growth, but they also have the greatest capacity to lose carbon.
Yeah. So the importance of ground cover. The other really important thing to notice here, I think as well, is often we talk about clays for protecting soil organic carbon. So organic carbon molecules can form organomineral complexes, so they get stored within the mineralogy of the soil as well. With our sandier soils, the organic matter is less protected, so it's even more important to focus on that surface soil protection in ground cover. In saying that, what we know about our rangeland soils is that there's a relatively constant, so while soil carbon is low in the top 10 centimetres, there's a relatively constant concentration down to 30 centimetres of organic carbon. So it's unlike in the eastern parts of the state where you have really high amounts of carbon in the top 10 centimetres and then it decreases with an increase in soil depth. It's quite different in the rangelands. So it's even every single layer of soil in the rangelands is really, really vital for keeping carbon in the soil, and carbon drives productivity and soil condition.
So when we're thinking about some of these landscapes, you spoke about the different responsiveness or the interactions with rainfall from the heavier country to the lighter red country. We often really focus on the periods of dry, but this, I guess, raises the importance of thinking about being rain ready and making sure that your landscapes are able to get the most moisture into the soil profile. What are some of the key differences between those two landscapes that affect water getting into that profile?
Really good point, I think, Kirsty. I'm still thinking about the wind erosion context. So the loss of carbon in the upper layers is probably related to that high concentration of sand, which is a function of a long geological time of wind erosion activity. So we strip out the really fines and we're left with the coarse sands, which then come back to your question about, or your comment about the infiltration effect. We've got a sandier soil, we've got that infiltration effect, we push carbon deeper into the soil profile. So we've got those soil storage, and then we go back to those heavier clay soils, which are really those old floodplains or contemporary floodplains, which are really complex soil-wise, aren't they?
Yes, so those heavier clay soils that we're talking about, particularly at those really low points in the landscape, are the cracking clay. So where you could almost fit a shovel down those big, massive cracks. And if we think about those parts of the landscape, when it rains, it takes a lot of water to wet those profiles up. So preferentially the water will fall down the cracks to begin with, and then it might disappear out of seep down further in the landscape. But once those soils get wetter, they can kind of boom and they can hold their very important sponge of nutrients and carbon and water for the bigger parts of the landscape as well. So while they might be harder to influence in the low rainfall environment, they're really important for landscape function.
Okay.
So are we seeing, I guess, in that the red sandier country, we're seeing a much more rapid response to less rainfall, where you do start getting some plant growth and changes in biomass, whereas those heavier storms, when they come through, are more likely to wet up and get that responsiveness in that heavier country. So how does that go in terms of erosion? So I'm expecting that we'll get from those different rainfall types, different erosion risks coming through, particularly from our sandy soil that may not respond so well in a really heavy, intense rainfall.
Yeah. I think that's certainly what we saw at the end of the millennium drought. There was reports of massive sheet erosion. So we'd gone from talking about soil loss with wind erosion and dust storms to just huge amounts of sheet erosion. So once again highlighting the importance of cover. So thinking about cover, how do we influence cover?
Grazing management, I think, is probably the biggest impact out there, it seems, and not just obviously with livestock, but thinking about all of the species that are grazing.
Total grazing. Yeah. And that, I think the cover is so pivotal, isn't it? Because then it can change, it can slow infiltration, it can slow runoff. It really is the means of trying to get that water attached to the soil for a longer time. So we could do our interventions and try to keep water in the landscape.
So like water ponding, water spreading, check banks.
So those engineering type styles. But really all that's about is just trying to keep water there. And cover would do the same job if you can get cover at the right density and level.
So should we have a look at some examples at a finer scale now, the property scale, and think about how those land systems might influence responsiveness?
Pause.
I think it also just highlights the complexity but also the importance of the producer in making those really important decisions, because we can talk about things at this property scale, the landscape scale, but all of those little decisions and all of that history is important in making decisions about moving livestock. So some people, and I think at this site we also spoke about key indicator species, so productive pasture species that producers are grazing for. So remember, carbon is an important part of the story, definitely, but it's only one part of the story. So in having perenniality in the landscape, bringing back perennial grasses and improving that function is really important, and that's all at the hands of the producer.
Yeah.
And I think that this really reinforces the expertise that producers develop around their particular landscape and how that responds to grazing and that interaction of rainfall. That I think often it's easy to underestimate the role that local knowledge and experience plays. And I think the importance of that observation over time and that getting to know those landscapes.
Yeah.
And the innovation, right? So at this particular property, the producer's talking to us about influencing microbial processes, on-farm composting. So things that perhaps traditionally hadn't been thought as possible in the Western Division or in the rangelands, and producers are going, nah, forget about that. If I want to do it, I'm going to think about ways to make it work, and working with scientists to evaluate that, which is such an exciting space in rangelands science.
Absolutely, and I think because rainfall can be so periodic, I think one of the really interesting things that soil biology can play in a production system is that it can help to extend the capacity of the plants to access water over a longer period of time. So as the soil starts to dry out, if you've got soil fungi and other organisms, they can extract more soil. More water rather.
Yep.
And so as they develop over time, they help to build soil structure, which of course helps water, rain infiltrate and get into that soil profile. They can extend the reach of the roots in that system. And so I think the opportunity that soil biology offers to increase access to nutrients as well as to water, I think is really important, and it can help to extend those periods of production and the time that plants can photosynthesize and produce carbohydrates for everybody, just a little bit longer each time.
And I think key there also is diversity above ground in terms of what we have, because that cycling and that I guess the partnerships that soil organisms play, particularly fungi with multiple species, is really important, and that's kind of key to resilience as well. I'm just going to click on another slide now so we can look at a slightly different landscape.
Can I just pick up on that? I think you made a point about carbon is only one of the players, and this conversation about that complexity of the below ground and above ground and the flow-on effects. We really can't understate that.
No,
we can measure carbon, we can say, yes, we've made this gain, but really it's about, well, how has the soil environment changed? How is it more resilient? How is it going to hang on to water for longer, to extend that window? That's where the complexity of the organisms working with soil development.
And there's
really
so much we don't know in that space. So it's easy to write it off because you go, it's really complex, it's hard, it's hard to measure, whatever, but it's like so important that it deserves the attention.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things for me in these landscapes is the pulsing nature of them. So you get rainfall and you get this responsiveness, whether that's in your biological crusts or in the plant itself. And that can vary, as we've talked about, with heavy or light rain, depending on the soil types. And you get that drying process, and then everything settles down and starts to slow down. And, it's a bit like Sunday morning. It's a bit hard to get going. And then the rain will come again. And that pulsing environment, and depending on the intensity of rain and the amount of rain, how much action you get and how much the landscape can actually change and respond.
And management makes the landscape rainfall ready so that it can respond.
Yeah.
Because the impact or the importance of that pulse comes down to, I guess, that landscape legacy and management in that site. So that's why it's so important.
And I guess this is really about managing that ground cover and making sure that you've got plants that are sitting there ready to go when that rain does come in. And we know that we've got some plant species that will just pop up with rain. Like I love that 5-minute grass. It'll just come up, and then you've got all of those other perennial plants that are sitting there and able to respond potentially for longer and much more rapidly.
Before we get to this, pointing the wrong way, speaking of responding to rainfall, can you give us just a couple of minutes on crusts?
Oh, okay. Yep. So if we think about something that we can visualise quite easily is plant growth, the 5-minute grass. So we'll have a rainfall event, we'll have some sort of time after, we'll have germination, and then the plants will rip along. So you can think about that beautiful parabolic curve. They respond, they grow, they flower, then they die, senesce. So if we think about that timeline, here's your 5-minute grass, and away they go. Biological soil crusts, So you've got a combination of mosses, lichens, liverworts, cyanobacteria, algae. It's a whole community, you know. So when we say biological soil crust,
It's everybody.
it's
It's everyone.
it's like
And they're fun.
saying-
They are so much fun.
Fun guys.
It's the party.
Yeah, that's right. It's like we're talking about a rainforest. A rainforest is a collection of multiple species. Biological crust is really this sort of the equivalent. It's a really broad umbrella term. But the organisms in biological crust respond incredibly quickly. So remember the 5-minute grass was taking this long? A biological crust after rainfall will take in the minute, 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
All of a sudden they're going, fantastic, let's get some production going. And what they're doing is they're photosynthesizing, they're producing carbohydrates with the whole process of starting to fulfill their life cycle. But as they're doing that, they're doing all those other functions. So they're capturing carbon, they're producing nitrogen, they're producing polysaccharides, which then feed bacteria, which then
particles together.
stick the soil particles together. So there's a whole range of different processes going on.
And all of them in succession are really important, aren't they?
Yeah.
So I want to touch on a point there, and that's around nitrogen. So what our work has shown is that carbon sequestration in the low rainfall zone is often firstly limited by nitrogen within that system. So these guys are really important for getting that nitrogen that's in the atmosphere into the soil. So one way we can do that is through legumes, and our research will be looking at legumes that we can bring into these systems so that they're really good for livestock productivity, but also for soil nitrogen. But the other way is through these biological crusts, some of which can fix nitrogen in the soil, which is important for carbon stabilisation. So really important.
And there is some research that's also talking about free living nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so we actually don't know a huge amount about how to support those in our systems. We suspect that they're really linked to a very diverse soil biome, so the more fun, more parties going on below the soil, the more likely you are to have those organisms that can fix nitrogen without necessarily being associated with the legume.
Definitely. And in the higher rainfall zone, we know that they can account for 40 to 60 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. So even if it's just a fraction of that in the low rainfall zone, where you actually, it's uneconomical to actually apply nitrogen, it's just really important. And we know that we're learning more and more about practices which support those. And one of those practices is grazing management and pulsing that carbohydrate influence through exudates into the soil. So remember, plants can switch on and off exudates and switch exudates really, really rapidly as well. So within that rhizosphere around the plant roots, they can change the exudates or the messengers that they're putting out into the soil within a matter of hours to respond to abiotic and biotic factors. So it's really important.
And we're also seeing some evidence that a plant that's got a larger soil biome or rhizosphere, and so more soil organisms living in the soil, have a larger capacity to store carbon, so they've got bigger carbon sinks, and that can drive a high rate of photosynthesis. So in these really responsive environments when water comes, if you've got more of those healthy rhizospheres and a more diverse rhizosphere, then potentially you're increasing the rate at which your plant's actually photosynthesizing.
Yeah, and you touched on a really important point to me the other day, Kirsty, and that was around that. I often talk about plants as being organic matter supplied to the soil, and you said, well, that sink of carbon is also really important for boosting plant growth. So it's like a two-way process,
Absolutely.
which is important to remember. So with this landscape here, Craig, do you want to talk us through what we're seeing?
So when I look at the, once again we can see the river systems. Let me get orientated. We can see the river system coming down, travelling down towards South Australia. And then we've got another little coming up from Queensland back down into Western New South Wales as well. The fact that we've got a river here and one down in here somewhere, tells us they're the low points. The bit in the middle, that's the high point. So essentially I would view this as what we'd probably call a really high floodplain zone. The soils in this area probably originally were a duplex soil, so sandy soils on top of clay soils. It's probably a really old relic of some really old river systems, and the river's probably been moving through geological time. This is now an old soil. In more recent times, that top layer of the soil has been degraded through total grazing pressure. most likely. Think back to the 1900s when there was an enormous amount of rabbit load.
Yeah.
That was an incredible degradation phase in the Australian rangelands. And so we've got what we call scalds. Basically, we've got an exposed bee horizon. The clay is now sealing up. Quite often they've got some sort of chemical cation in there. It could be a sodium base. So they could be sealing a sodic sort of bee horizon. But critically what we see is that it's scalded, it's hard, infiltration's really low, if at all, and then you get maximum runoff.
Yeah.
Self-perpetuating.
Yeah, and so when you think about when we talk about rainfall, and then we talk about effective rainfall, because just because the rain falls doesn't mean that it enters the soil. So we actually want more of that rain that's falling to enter the soil. This environment is what we might describe as a brittle environment, but if you can just see here the role of land management. So if we look at the property boundaries, which are highlighted in blue here, and the cover on the scalds inside the fences and outside, so there's a really important role that in this case here, grazing management, so that's timing and intensity, as well as those more engineering interventions, so ripping on the scalds, keeping the water there through ponding as well. So you can just see that it can be quite a phenomenal response that you see, and those above ground responses are reflected below ground in soil function and carbon.
Yeah, those engineering processes are sort of like this fundamental shift, aren't they? It's a little bit of a booster to say, actually, water, just hang in this landscape for a little bit longer, just to give us enough time to get the plants going again.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting if we go back to crusts. There's, we talk about biological crusts and physical crusts. These scalds are dominated by physical crusts. And a physical crust is where the individual soil particles are resorting themselves and basically form a compacted layer. So it could be a depositional or it could be a structural crust.
Like an armour on the top.
An armour on the top, yeah. And it's just about the particles resorting. And then you've got the biological crust where you've got sort of this ecological succession trying to get away and get on with it. But often in these landscapes, they're trapped in what we call the lower successional species. So the cyanobacteria, they don't quite get to the mosses and the lichens.
Yeah, and what we saw on some of the scalds here were those little pedestals, weren't they? Just, you can see when you're driving along the highway, you might see a pedestal that's sitting up, so that means that there's soil that's kind of hanging about where all the rest has been washed away. But on these scalds, you could see those kind of little micro pedestals almost, where a biological crust was holding on, and maybe 2 mil of soil had been lost from the area surrounding. But it just shows that kind of importance of that life on the soil in helping plants reestablish as well.
You often see that when you move a cow paddock, and you see underneath that there's been this really rich life processes that have been going on in that high, suddenly more intensely supported with nutrients kind of environment, and you get that formation of those crusts in that spot.
And that reminded me, so the producer here, very innovative and enthusiastic and has so many great ideas and kind of wanted to start yesterday on everything. One of the things he'll be looking at will be holding livestock on some of these panned areas to break up those physical crusts. So did you want to talk a little bit about that, Craig, and what that...
Yeah, I'm glad you raised it, because I think it's a really interesting conundrum that we need to sort of crack. That idea that we've got crusts, whether it's a physical or a biological crust, on these scalded zones, and you're still not quite getting that infiltration going. If we step right back and think, well, how would this landscape been operated? What else is missing from the landscape? And it would have been that disturbance process. So that disturbance could have been from small marsupials, that were just doing digging on a regular basis. And that is just breaking that cycle. We don't have those small marsupials anymore. So why don't we use the stock? Why don't we bring them in in a controlled fashion and see at the right time.
At the right time,
the
so
right
that the
time.
moisture's right, and you're not going to do damage, but you're kind of promoting or facilitating
That's
that
right.
change.
So some of those really important disturbance mechanisms, I think, relate to the intensity of that disturbance.
Yeah.
So how much of that and for how long. The breadth of that, like how much of the landscape's actually impacted by that. And if you've got a really sensitive environment like these, then maybe doing that in a small area and seeing what happens is the way to go. And so that, and recognising that with that disturbance comes a whole range of potential responses from the landscape. So too much disturbance and you might start to degrade the landscape further. Not enough and you'll get no change. Or, you know, just the right amount and you might tip it up into another state and support that to move into the next level.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a really important point too. You know, we can go to any water trough, can't we? And we can see that disturbance zone, you know, and too much disturbance actually does produce a soil that's not going to recover. You know, you've broken the structure, you've broken the biology, you've broken the water infiltration. But what we're talking, the sort of disturbance we're sort of here is can you use it as a tool?
Yeah.
Can you be carefully apply it in a way that is mimicking that sort of short-term disturbance triggers?
Yeah. So a lot of what we're talking about in these landscapes is livestock as tools to actually repair some of the degradation that's there from decades or centuries of different managements. So I think that's a really important point because when we're talking before about pasture composition, productivity, that root exudation and driving that process, that can be influenced by grazing livestock.
Yeah.
Composition can, and now we're talking about livestock as another tool in a different context. And with any tool, it can be overused, so it needs to be still planned, monitored, and an informed decision made. But certainly, I think there's opportunity here. It's not about removing livestock because that's not going to necessarily fix it. It's about seeing that cycle. And something we didn't touch on there, but is also the manure that passes through those livestock as well, and the movement of seed around the landscape.
Again, those spots of accumulation of nutrients that potentially...
Spots, that's right, which is really important.
Germinate. Yeah. And I think what you've just said there as well, Susan, you talked about monitoring as being a really important part of that. And so understanding the impact of that grazing intensity or that particular grazing period and how the landscape responds over time, because as we've heard, the different soil types and the different rainfall just prior to that means that producers are managing a really complex process, and that each time you apply that grazing, that potentially that needs to be different to get a different effect given the amount of rain or the condition of the landscape. And so again, that knowledge and that local adaptation by producers about that grazing management, I think, is really important.
And part of our work is looking at building the metrics around demonstrating the importance of good land management as well. So there is so much public good benefit that comes from privately managed agricultural land. And we really need to shift the focus from seeing a dust storm in Sydney and going, that's bad grazing management out west, to going, actually, let's look at the great news stories that we have out there. And there's emerging markets where people can diversify farm income. One is carbon trading, but there's other ecosystem service markets where we can, if we've got the numbers, which our collective R&D is aiming to achieve, then we can look at how farmers could enter that for rangelands products.
So part of that might be biodiversity payments. So we're seeing more and more sort of state-based or government-based biodiversity payments for ecosystem service type arrangements, but we're also seeing the development of private markets in that space. And I think that's really exciting that for producers who are able to demonstrate that their management over time is contributing to this regenerating landscapes, then I think that's potentially, you know, another opportunity for producers to be recognised and rewarded for that effective management.
Yeah, and something I think often gets mentioned is just about how slow things happen in the rangelands. And yes, most certainly, climate and soil type can be kind of, I guess, they're major drivers of plant productivity and carbon sequestration. But there's a whole lot of innovations out there which are speeding up some of these processes. And this particular property is a great example of that, where they're saying, well, it's not just about having a plant there and there, I want plant in between as well. What can I do? And that's where the role of perhaps some of these biological products that we'll be trialling, different types of grazing management, that intensity that we just spoke about on the score. So how can we make the change more rapid so that we can see that change
Totally agree, and I think it's a really important point to reflect on. You know, we quite frequently talk about accelerated degradation or accelerated wind erosion. You know, thinking about the anthropogenic, volume knob. It actually can flip the other way. You know, if we can understand small scale processes, how management can be used to tweak it, you can actually start to move that pendulum back. So
yeah, and so what's quite different about the work that we're all collaborating on at the moment is that we've got an observational and co-design approach to this research. So it's not about us just looking in the literature and then trying to roll things out in the New South Wales rangelands. There certainly is a component of that because data is king, so it's really important to have data and evidence. But what we're doing is we're working with these really innovative producers in the Western Division and anyone who's interested actually just to try something different, because we've already highlighted the importance of the land manager in making change.
Yeah. So we've got this complex change in soil characteristics, clay rich, silt, sand, back into a higher red sandier soil, probably a duplex soil.
So that represents the particle sizes. That's what.
Correct.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So you've got your smaller particles, which are your clay. So that's the finer particles, and then you've got your silts, the next size up, and your sands are the bigger ones.
Yeah.
So Craig, can you just give us like a 1 minute overview of abrasion? So the role of saltation. So
Yeah. Okay.
the role of sands in training.
Yep. So if we think about wind as a fluid, and we think about speed of that wind, so if you've got a wind that's blowing about 35 kilometres per hour, it will have the potential to move a sand particle which is about 0.8 of a millimetre. You know, that size is the most vulnerable or the easiest to move. A 0.8 millimetre sand grain loves to move. It will just run wherever the wind takes it. But because it's also 0.8 of a millimetre and it's quartz, it means it's heavy. So instead of getting up into the air and blowing long distance, it actually bounces. And so that's the saltation. And every time it hits the ground, every time it comes back, it's a source of impact, which then blows out more sand particles or silt particles or clay particles. And so you start to build the dust cloud. So if you've got a coarse material, or in fact, come on this side, if you've got a sandy soil over here, which is then saltated across a really fine clay-rich lake, you've got a great potential for that saltation effect and more dust to be coming off it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in terms of that country, the sandier country where you've actually got plants growing, I guess that reinforces the importance of those plants in that landscape to potentially catch that and slow that down.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the plants are doing a couple of things there. We talk about surface roughness. So if you think of a tabletop where it's dead smooth, the force of the wind, so the friction on the wind is right at that tabletop surface. As soon as you put some roughness on it, like a plant, now the strongest wind is at the top of the plant, not at the soil surface. So the more roughness you get, the greater protection that you have. And then if you start to think about the patchiness of those clumps of grass or plants, those plants now act as a filter. So if you've got an area sitting over here, which is low clumpiness, low vegetation, it might be a source area, so sediment's moving, and then it moves over towards Sue's, which is the vegetation.
I'm the clump.
And now you're the trap. So we start to get these
clump,
sounding mounds. Yeah. So it's that sort of give and take.
Yeah, and that's often what you'll see in that blue bush country, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you'll see that kind of trap of all the sediment and fine material around the blue bush and then in between.
So in terms of those obstructions on those traps, that's not just living plants, is it?
That's right. It can be.
Yeah. Fence lines are a really good example.
Yeah.
You know, everyone who drives this landscape will know in the depth of drought phase, you'll be able to drive along and you'll see the sand mounds that are along fence lines or cattle yards, which probably date back to the 1930s or the 1900s, you know, where large volumes were moving.
Yeah. I just thought of something. When we're looking at these lake beds, so this is where in this landscape a lot of lake bed cropping occurs. So it requires quite a bit of rainfall to fill up the lakes, and then when the water drains away, you've got a good soil moisture profile so that you can sow crops. And so some of these lake beds might be, how big was the one that we went to see? Was it 9,000?
9,000 acres, I think it was.
Yeah,
so
so
potentially 12 foot of water. So I should know what that is in metric, but I can't convert it. It was like really a lot of water, which is pretty extraordinary because you're not getting that rainfall in those areas.
That's right, but they're these big drainage environments, aren't they? But what I wanted to touch on there is one of the sites that we went to. So the crop had been in 2014, I think, and it hadn't been cropped since. So first of all, there was still standing stubble, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And the other thing was that when you looked in amongst that stubble, you could pick up a handful of wheat residues, which just looked like straw that had been from last year's crop. Now, the reason that's important is around the rate of decomposition. So we need to do more work because in this area, because we really don't have a great understanding about the rate of decomposition in this environment. So while the carbon accumulation might be low, the loss, if you can protect the soil surface, is quite low because you've got this low rate of decomposition. So in terms of the vulnerability, we might take that stubble back to the lab and go, well, it was quite labile, it would have been gone within a matter of months. Well, we know in this environment, that's rubbish. It's actually going to stay there for a long time. If you've got management practices in place, which will keep carbon in the landscape, and that comes back to that good ground cover management. And ground cover is obviously where people make their money as well, because there's that ground cover, gives us biomass and plants for our livestock to consume. So if we had a situation where people are looking at their rolling rainfall and they see that they need to maybe move stock or destock, and they're actually looking at that standing vegetation as an income as well, so not just thinking about their livestock, but going, you know what, I've actually got however much dollars per hectare in ground cover there, because they're part of a scheme which incentivizes that, then I think that would help in some of these decisions as well. So you could be a carbon stubble livestock farmer and everybody farmer.
That's right. And so I guess it's the complexity of making decisions and understanding or being able to value the differences of those different potential income streams, whether or not that's through your livestock or through the value of retaining fertility and your soil by keeping those stubbles or those smaller plants or other obstructions in the landscape.
Yeah. And I think the thing with a service provision is that can be an annual payment. So that's how these systems can work. So with carbon trading at the moment, you get paid for how much carbon you put into the soil. And it's not an ongoing payment, it's just a payment for the sequestration. So if it's half a tonne per hectare per year, then that's how much you get paid for. In terms of a service provision, that's an annual payment for keeping something there. So I think keeping carbon in the landscape, that would be a great thing that we could incentivise, but certainly keeping ground cover so that we can reduce the incidence of wind erosion and that sheet erosion would be really important as well, because these are really beautiful and complex landscapes.
And just so incredibly diverse. So I think about, right across those rangelands, you do drive a reasonable distance, but you get these incredibly diverse patches, and on each site I think we went to, there are patches of eucalypts or different vegetation types, different grass species compositions that you get depending on the soil and the location of the landscape, and it's quite extraordinary how much variation there is out there.
So I think that resonates with me, Suze, about the idea of using the right tool at the right time at the right scale, and then to develop tools that are sensitive enough to measure that as well. So that's part of the challenge that I think we still have to deal with.
And I like that you use the word challenge, because it is a challenge, but it's certainly not a barrier. So people often say it's too hard or it's too expensive, or I think we'll get another job then. That's the exciting part, right? If we're working with producers which can increase carbon, which can increase cover, we're not being restrictive on how they do that necessarily, but we're bolting on the scientific observations so that we can demonstrate the value of that change. And I think that's what's really exciting about our current work is just that genuine collaboration with producers, and we're learning every day, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for me, I think it really reinforces that variability in each landscape and how much each production system is different from the one next door, and
Yeah.
within that system has so much variation and complexity and need for different approaches across that landscape. So that's pretty extraordinary. And it reflects the level of skill that producers develop over time as they understand their landscape, and I think that's pretty extraordinary.
Without a doubt. And I think if producers in these landscapes are talking about products and new interventions and multi-species pastures, and I don't think it's our role to tell them.
No, absolutely not. No.
If you think, we're happy to be kind of part of that story and collect the evidence, as I said, data, and the producers we're working with always say they want the numbers, don't they?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's about the data.
Isn't that the really exciting thing, to be able to be that person that's curious about what's happening? And I think a lot of what we're trying to do is to better understand some of those processes and drivers so that we can help other people pick up those strategies or help communicate what was successful or what wasn't so successful about that particular approach.
So here, now we've moved to a property near Cobar, and this is quite different to the other landscapes that we've seen now. Beautiful red soils, has a nice mix of both sand and clay. And Craig, did you want to have a little bit of a chat about what we've seen here?
So it appears that we've got a streamline or a river system down the right-hand side. We would expect to find the heavier clays once again, obviously in those lower parts or those depositional environments. Would imagine we're moving up into the higher, well, away from the rivers, so we're back onto the plains sort of country, and that's where we get those nice red soils. There appears to be a lot more tree cover than any other sites we've got, so I would speculate we're probably in a higher rainfall zone.
That's right.
Maybe there's some topographic influence as well, which is starting to drive
which is why we've also
localised
got
rain.
some cropping, like occasional cropping,
And
which
that's
occurs.
this bit down here, is it?
Yeah.
Yep. So that's probably a sown pasture crop.
So down here is the site that we went to. So we've done a fair bit of work in this on this property. Carbon stocks were around 40 to 50 tonnes per hectare in the top 30 centimetres. So as I said, they're very highly responsive red soils, and can't kind of understate just how well this producer does in his grazing management as well.
Yeah.
And so most of that's around trying to maintain that ground cover. Is that one of the core decisions?
Yes.
With grazing intensity?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. Some of the producers that we went and visited and spoke to, just how important that they saw soil function as well.
Yeah.
So it was like, I want to improve soil function and soil water. So therefore I look at ground cover and diversity, and that's important because that feeds livestock. But it was funny that that's way the way the information was often layered, and for a soil scientist, like that's cool, right? But,
absolutely.
But I think it goes back to the way of thinking though as well, that they're appreciating that soil is your resource base. Certainly this is your canvas in terms of what you can and can't do, and understanding, and we've spoken a lot about that today, understanding the background, I guess, the history of your landscape, what you're working with, but also what you can influence.
Yeah.
And it seems to me as well that this really reinforces that you can't change the rainfall that you receive, but you can change the amount that your landscape's able to actually use out of that. So that rainfall effectiveness, or being rain ready, is really important.
And so the really big take home, and I think the transformative thinking is that world of ground cover. And it's not just a number, presented across by a pixel, a satellite output to say I've got 40%. It's thinking about the complexity, what sort of diversity do I have that then feeds my soil structure, that feeds my soil organisms. So
and the function of that ground cover.
That's right.
So just the role that it's playing in these production systems. So I often go back to talking about carbon, but in terms of underpinning production in these systems, ground cover and pasture composition is so important, and managing livestock to influence that.
And I think another part of that thinking that really struck me in listening to these producers was how far into the future that they're thinking. So as the landscape's starting to dry out and they're starting to think about whether they need to destock or change the way that they're grazing or the amount of time in each pasture, each paddock, that there was always that thinking about how what I'm doing today will affect the responsiveness of my landscape with the next rainfall event. And so that thinking about banking or reflecting on how much capacity I'm retaining in my landscape to take advantage of the next rainfall rather than thinking about how much can I use today.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to also resilience, and what was, I think, so encouraging on all the properties that we've visited is just having kids back on farms as well, and the connection to the landscape and the long-term thinking, like you said. So it's about having a successful business out there and being part of a successful and vibrant community.
And seeing the innovation of the next generations coming through and the excitement about some of those new enterprises and new ways of thinking about the landscape, that was pretty exciting. Pretty
so I think what we've seen is that the change is definitely possible. Exciting things are happening in the rangelands, and we're really keen to be part of that story and support producers in that space. It is possible to increase soil carbon in the rangelands, but it's just about knowing the right time, the right practice, the right place. And there's some exciting opportunities to diversify farm income with some of these new emerging markets. Anything else you guys wanted to say to finish off?
I think for me as well, just reflecting on how important the role of producer innovation is, and that for me is such a core part of building these really strong, vibrant communities and really vibrant, profitable, highly functioning farm systems.
And innovation really is just about the willingness to think outside, which is great.
And try something different.
Which is great.
Right.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Excellent.
Thanks for coming along and joining the green room.
Thanks, everyone.